Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jessica Gonzalez. I am the Project Associate at the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network Coordinating Office. Welcome to Virtual Learning Session 4, part of the National School Mental Health Learning Collaborative. This is being co-facilitated by the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network and the National Center for School Mental Health. Today's session will focus on screening. And if you have not done so already, please click on the link in the chat box to sign in. We're going to start with a few reminders. Next slide. So the first one is really important. If you are using audio through a telephone line, please mute yourself, and you can go ahead and unmute yourself using *6. If you are using computer audio, you can unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon to the right of your name on the participant list. If you have any questions during the presentation, please enter them in the chat box and we'll do our best to get those answered before we close out today. And lastly, we do have an evaluation at the end of this session. We'll be posting the link to the evaluation in the chat box during the last 5 minutes of the session, and we really do appreciate you taking the time to provide feedback. Next slide. We have just a couple of quick announcements. We did send out an email blast earlier this week announcing that the National School Mental Health Curriculum is now available on the MHTTC website. For those of you who are new to our Learning Collaborative, this curriculum was developed by the MHTTC network and the National Center for School Mental Health to help states, districts, and schools across the United States understand the core components of comprehensive school mental health. The curriculum is intended to be used with district teams that can influence, develop, and oversee school mental health systems at the school district and building levels. The curriculum contains trainer and participant manuals and slide decks, and we will also continue to upload recordings of these virtual learning sessions, which are intended to be a deeper dive into some of the curriculum content. So to access the curriculum, you can visit our website. You'll see the link there on the slide, and I'll also be adding it to the chat box in a little bit. Next slide. And so we understand that we do have some new folks who have not yet had the opportunity to connect with the MHTTC in their region. So you can visit our website and select your center at the link that's displayed on the screen. We'll also add that to the chat box in a bit, and that's just a way to get connected with the MHTTC in your region. If you have any questions related to school mental health products or resources that the MHTTC offers, or any questions in regards to utilizing the curriculum that we just rolled out, please feel free to connect with your center. Once again, we do thank you all for joining in today, and we will now pass it on to the National Center for School Mental Health to start today's presentation on screening.
I think you guys can see me now, and I want to confirm that you can also hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. My name is Jill Bonenkamp. I'm an assistant professor at the National Center for School Mental Health. I met many of you at our in-person meeting, and I'm thrilled to be joining you today as we talk in more depth and detail about screening. We'll be talking in brief detail about screening as a bigger part of a multi-tiered system of support system in schools, and touching on some key pre-planning considerations. We are thrilled to have an in-depth district example from John Crocker, Director of School Mental Health and Behavioral Services at Methuen Public Schools. And we'll also be hearing a wonderful presentation from Michael Furlong, professor at UC Santa Barbara, about screening for mental health and well-being in schools. As we kick off our screening webinar today, I just wanted to include our definition about school mental health screening, that this is using a tool or process to identify student strengths and needs, and that screening is used to identify students at risk for mental health concern or substance use. And as we get started, and before we hear a more in-depth example of what this looks like in practice, I wanted us to touch on the value of screening. And we have a lot of discussion around screening, what this looks like and what this means. But one of the biggest value of mental health screening in schools, and as it's part of a multi-tiered system of support, is it allows us to shift to be proactive versus being reactive. It allows us to think more systematically about our resource allocation. So if we only have a limited number of school social workers, school counselors, and expanded school mental health clinicians and community resources, how do we make sure that our students with the highest needs are receiving those services, that we're not missing students who may in fact have high needs, and that we're thinking about tier 1 and tier 2 supports that may better benefit students who are currently receiving tier 3 services. Screening allows us to do early intervention, and we are able to catch and think about students who may have early risk, and we could provide lower tier services to help to mitigate that risk and to put them on track for school success. Screening is really critical when we think about crisis prevention and school safety. And when I say that, I'm very thoughtful about what I mean by that. And I mean that we want to make sure that we're addressing student concerns early, and so that we're using that proactive approach, that we're able to meet students' needs, understand needs, make sure that we're getting students the supports that they need early in the process, and that we're especially thinking about resources for students with internalizing concerns who may not show up in our more typical referral processes. Before we even think about what our process might be, we want to make sure that we are very slow, methodical, and thoughtful about this process. So as you will hear from John Crocker today, and as many folks who are doing school mental health screening will say, what was critical to their success was a multi-stakeholder planning process with students and families at the forefront of that. That there was deep consideration around cultural needs and the specific needs of the student body, and a really intentional consideration of unintentional side effects. So we've had discussions about, and I know this came up during our meeting, that we want to make sure with our screening that we are doing good, and that we are not having any concerns about the screening process not being trauma-informed. We want to make sure that it's trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive, and that it's helping to support our students. And we'll have really clear examples of that, and looking forward to hearing from Dr. Furlong about screening for mental health strengths and well-being, and how that can support your multi-tiered systems of support. As we talk about for all quality improvement, not just in school mental health, but especially in school mental health, starting small is really critical in this intentional process, that we can very quickly see what are strengths of our process and where we may need to make improvements if we're starting with one student in one classroom, and then really thinking and receiving feedback about that process. And as we're thinking about our considerations for screening or not screening and weighing those considerations, we also want to consider what are our risks of not screening, and making sure that is in our process as we're doing this pre-planning. So I quickly wanted to pull up a couple of slides. This is included in the curriculum, so I won't spend a ton of time on this, but I just wanted to highlight that when we're thinking about potential barriers, there are a number of strategies we may use to address those. Again, this visual and importance of starting small. And I also wanted to draw attention to our screening action steps. That very critical is this first step of building a foundation, and second step of clarifying goals, and remind folks that we have a number of details in the school mental health curriculum, the national curriculum, that you can reference. Assembling a team is critical as part of this multi-stakeholder process for doing your pre-planning. What this may look like in process is gathering input via focus groups, parent-staff meetings, feedback cards, thinking about how your goals fit with other initiatives in your district. and thinking about how students are currently being identified. Really critical for us to think about how we are making sure, if we are embarking in doing school mental health screening, that we're thinking about complex stress related to poverty, immigration, and language barriers, cultural beliefs about mental health and how concerns should be addressed, marginalized and underserved groups, and how we want to make sure that our process is helping us to be more inclusive, and thinking about that our strengths-based approach may be a very good approach for us, and we're excited to highlight what that would look like in practice with Dr. Furlong's presentation. Getting and gathering some initial data or using data that already exists is also another way to better understand what some of the potential benefits might be for screening and what you may miss and not be able to tackle if you're not screening. So thinking about that, students who scored in the moderate to severe range for depression are absent 47% more often than average. And this is a really critical piece to understand as you're thinking about your multi-tiered system of support. There's also data that exists in the public domain via surveillance data that you may want to consider as using for screening data, or that you may use as a pre-step prior to screening. It is very critical in your screening process to make sure that you're clarifying goals, that it is not screening just for the purpose of screening, but that there's a very clear purpose. And then also just wanted to highlight a number of the resources that are available to you. These are in your curriculum, but just wanted to highlight the School Mental Health Screening and Assessment Library, which is housed on the SHAPE system. It's currently live now in the current format, and we're excited for the SHAPE 2.0 launch in August. And also wanted to draw your attention to the School Mental Health Screening Playbook. And then here are our quality indicators. Again, if you're looking to embark in school mental health screening processes, thinking about using these quality indicators either on their own or using them via the SHAPE system to assess where you currently are to help to inform your quality improvement processes. And with that, I will turn it over to John Crocker. Thank you so much for being with us today, John.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be able to present on this topic. And I'll be with you for the next, I guess, like 30 to 40 minutes discussing our implementation efforts in Methuen, Massachusetts. So we can start with the first slide. So I wanted to embed this discussion in the context of what is a much larger discussion. So screening is very much a piece of a big puzzle when it comes to school mental health implementation. We were very fortunate to be able to engage with the National Center for School Mental Health about 5 years ago, I believe. And we were one of 12 districts that participated in the first cohort of the National Quality Initiative Collaborative for Improvement and Innovation Network. And a lot of the work that we engaged in during that period of time was assessing the degree to which we were establishing a comprehensive school mental health system. We did that by using the SHAPE system and by reflecting on our engagement in practices that aligned with the national performance measures. So if we could jump to the next slide. This is the definition of comprehensive school mental health system, and this was really the driving force behind our work. We wanted to establish a CSMHS so that we could really feel as though we had a multi-tiered system of social, emotional, mental health services and supports, that we had strong linkages with our community-based partners, that we were being sensitive to our families and engaging with them, that we were being sensitive to our students' needs, and that, the hallmark of this program, that we're using evidence-based services and supports. One of the things that we noticed right away when we were engaging in our use of the SHAPE system is that our use of data was lacking. I think that it's the case with a lot of districts that psychosocial data, screening data that represents students' needs relative to mental health concerns is few and far between, and we wanted to address that by really attacking that head on and being able to be proactive by addressing that specific domain within SHAPE. Next slide, please. These are the performance measures as we were engaging with them at that time. I know with SHAPE 2.0 there's a revisiting of this and a reconstitution of the performance measures, but universal screening is very much alive and well in that reorganization. So that's what we'll be focusing on today, but I did want to give a view of kind of what we were focused on at that time in terms of really addressing different pieces of our implementation from a quality standpoint and from a sustainability standpoint. And as I present on screening, we will be tackling pieces of the quality side, but certainly on the sustainability side as well. Next slide. So when we think about screening, I definitely see it as a universal. It's when we're looking at a tiered system of support, this is one of the pieces that serves as a means to support prevention and to be able to get to students early. In that we seek to screen all students, it is a universal practice and allows for us to get an aggregate understanding of our students' needs. Next slide. Early on in the process, we were very much focused on quality improvement, and I wanted to put this slide in the slide deck to kind of emphasize the idea that Jill was alluding to, that we absolutely started small. We did not go into this thinking, let's just screen the entire high school for depression and see what happens. I think that would be really irresponsible. We worked slowly to build up, and next slide, please. The idea behind this was that, you know, these very small tests of change would lead to larger implementation over time. And I'll talk about that as we kind of move through the different phases of implementation that we experienced in Methuen. I'm going to talk a little bit about the practices and how they evolved over time, and then we'll talk about how the data shifted over time. So it'll be two disparate timelines that will make sense as we kind of move through the presentation. Next slide. So at the outset of this, we had a lot of questions. We had not engaged in this work previously. I think that the most that we had done to date was really around things like the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which does not identify students. We had some information from surveys, but again, that didn't really point to any specific student. It was more just an aggregate understanding of a potential need that we could address, but it didn't allow for us to be preventative. We had questions about consent. We had questions about which screening tools we could use, where to find them, which populations we were going to look at. We had questions around sustainability. How are we going to pay for this? How are we going to train staff? And how are we going to keep this program going year after year? Next slide. So I really appreciate what was said around preparing for screening. I don't think it's something that should just be done without forethought and planning. And the piece around generating support was, for us, aligned well with an initiative that we were engaged in at the same time as as we sought to implement a comprehensive school mental health system. So as we were implementing PBIS, at the very same time we were seeking to establish a CSMHS. And the district really took notice of the fact that we were putting a lot of time and energy into supporting students comprehensively. We heard from our teaching staff and our administrators that students' needs were not being met in a way that was effective, and that in order to get to a point where we could feel as though we could get to the academic piece, we needed to first address students' needs. One of the mantras that was really developed at that time, and that has persisted over the years that we've implemented, is that if you don't provide students with the services and supports that they need, that they really cannot achieve academically in the way that we want them to and in the way that they want to. So I think that there is a campaign that has to happen so that we can ensure that our staff, our parents, our students are all understanding what we're moving toward. The other piece that I think is worth mentioning, and I do not believe that I have a slide on this, but we did put together a mental health parent-student advisory council early on in our implementation, and screening was a big piece of the conversation at that time. We wanted our parents and students to be able to provide feedback to help guide our implementation. If we're not aligning our services and supports with their specific needs, then it misses the point. So that was one additional piece that I would recommend, is really leveraging your parents and students in a formal way to be able to draw upon their perspectives and also to support implementation, because we learned a lot from our students very early on, and anyone who works in schools knows that students are very vocal about what they need oftentimes, and when you give them the forum to speak up, that they are ready participants. Next slide. I think that this constitutes one of the most important pieces in terms of screening, but also in terms of school mental health in general, is ensuring that we are preparing our staff to be able to engage in screening, engage in evidence-based therapeutic support, engage in the types of practices that we hold dear and that we are thinking of when we think of school mental health. So we did provide a fair amount of professional development, and there definitely was a shift in terms of what we were asking our staff members to do. And I think that shift very much aligns with the evolving role of school mental health staff. It would not be accurate for me to say that everyone just bought in right away. I think that we needed to really commit to this. We needed to be able to have explanations for why these things were important. But when we were ready to talk about this, when we were able to say, well, if you do this work well, and if you provide this opportunity for students to access services earlier, and we engage in things like screening, well, then you're going to have less time providing crisis counseling. You're going to have less critical incidents to deal with. You'll be able to address the needs of students more readily. That resonated with staff and allowed for us to do the work in a way that everyone was moving in the same direction. Next slide. So I want to start to talk about what things look like at the very beginning when we made the decision that screening was going to happen. So it would be, I feel like I'm glossing over quite a bit in terms of like the build up to screening, but suffice to say that teaming was a big piece of it, that a comprehensive move toward supporting students holistically was a piece of this, that we definitely engaged with our stakeholders and ensured that we were providing them with info around why we wanted to do this. So once that was really well established, we began to kind of rapidly test at the micro level. And this is going back to why I wanted to include a couple slides on PDSA cycles, just to be able to provide a little bit of prompting around this does need to start small, and it needs to start small, but also with intention, so that we are putting these tests into play, analyzing them, and making decisions from cycle to cycle around how we can improve. So we really, and I think, Jill, you alluded to this, we started with one student, and we screened that student, we secured active consent, we selected a tool that we believed matched up with our population's needs, and we took that data and sat with it. And I remember meeting with our mental health team and saying, all right, well, what can we do with this data? How will this inform our practice? Is this something that we could use on a broader scale? When I'm meeting with this student, will I be better prepared to support this student? And how can we use this data at the aggregate level? If we were to screen 5, 10, 15, a classroom full of students, what would this data tell us about our services and supports? So the PDSA cycle approach, where we were kind of rapidly testing, analyzing that information, making decisions to scale up, that was a really huge part of our process. And I remember conducting PDSA cycles every month, and And every month we had one on screening to be able to kind of advance that practice. Because we did move from one student to a classroom to a grade level school and now a district. And I'll talk about that journey as we kind of go through these slides. We did start with active consent because it seemed like the quickest way to ensure that we were doing right at the time. But we very quickly realized that active consent would pose a barrier to advancing this practice on a large scale. And I'll talk about this, the evolving practices as we move forward. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about how we selected screening measures. One of the ways in which we, or I guess one of the first tasks that we were posed with was, how do we, why are we screening, right? What's the purpose behind our screening program? Do we want to identify students with needs? Do we want to be able to point to strengths that our students have? How are we going to select measures that are free, ideally, that are quality measures? And what are we going to do with this data? How are these data going to inform our practice? Next slide. Ultimately, we decided to use problem-specific screening tools, and I will mention a few of these throughout the presentation. The justification for use of a problem-specific screeners, we had a lot of information from some of these surveys that I've mentioned, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. We had counselors collecting data through a counseling log. And a lot of the data indicated, not surprisingly, that anxiety, depression, and trauma were issues that our students faced. And I think that that is, I don't think that that would be foreign to anyone on this webinar. I think that probably everyone on this webinar is living or working in a district where anxiety and depression tends to be a problem for some of our youth population. So we felt like we were addressing the problem directly by using screening tools that directly measured the degree to which anxiety and depression were problems for our students. We also felt like we would be able to get a very rich data set by using multiple different problem-specific screeners and piecing those, bringing those data sets together so that we could understand the specific depressive depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms. We could understand the global scale, subscales that we used, and bring all of that together to be able to really paint a picture of a student's comprehensive needs. And we felt like that was a much better way to be able to develop actionable data sets. Next slide. So I think it's important for us to talk about kind of where we started, again, with one student. And then as we kind of progressed through this, we realized that there were ways where we could be more efficient. There were ways where we could produce data that was more actionable. And we could develop systems that would ease the burden of screening. And this is something that I hear a lot when I talk about districts, is that there's this concern that screening is going to be a burden, that it's going to be difficult to actually implement because there's so many steps. And I will agree that there are a number of steps that you need to take, but you can also find ways to be very efficient. So I'll talk about that, I believe, in the next slide. Well, not quite yet. We'll talk about consent first, and then I'll kind of wrap up with where we moved from our initial stages to our later stages of screening. So consent is something that we definitely had questions about. And as I stated previously, active consent was what we went with initially. And for those of you who, let's define this for those of you that perhaps are not super familiar with active consent. We are sending out consent forms. We are actively engaging parents and students in saying, you must sign off that we can do this. With passive consent, which is ultimately what we have gone with, we are sending notice to parents and students and indicating that we are going to be conducting screening. If you do not want us to conduct screening with your child, please contact us. Here are the opt-out procedures. We post this regularly. We send it out through our all-call system. We ensure that every parent is aware of the message that we send out in terms of, if you don't want to be a part of this, please don't. That's okay. And I do not believe that the goal of screening is to, I don't think it's realistic to say that we're going to get every single student to screen. But I do think that the vast majority of students actually do engage in screening. When we put the passive consent system into place, we had less than 1% of parents opt out of screening. And because it was such a small number, I took it upon myself to call these parents and ask them, why are you not engaging in this screening process? And a lot of times it was a misunderstanding in terms of they didn't know what it was for. They didn't really listen to the message. They just kind of opted out. And once I explained it, they said, oh, well, that's actually something that I'm okay with. Please, can you put my son or daughter back on the list? There were a couple instances in which there were parents who indicated that, my son or daughter has already been identified for services. I don't feel as though including them in this is going to yield anything that we don't already know. So I think that the very small number of parents who opted out either opted out because they had already bought into the processes in some way, shape, or form outside of our screening program, or they really didn't understand what they were opting out of. So this is the passive consent message that we send out regularly. We actually read a version of this to students right before we screen, because we allow for parents and students to opt out. And if a student wants to opt out in real time, that is absolutely okay with us. We don't want to cause discomfort to students. We don't want them to engage in anything that's going to cause them to feel as though they are not safe in school. Next slide. The other piece that, as we kind of talk about this evolving practice of screening, we did start out with paper and pencil screening, and it looked very much like the image on the left, and it was, I think it's a huge draw on time. We are Google schools. We ultimately use Google tools to be able to build out these screening tools with Google Forms, and what that did is it created a database for us very readily, where we could filter on and sort by scores and move from screening to follow-up in less than 20 minutes. And for those who are on the call now who have perhaps engaged in screening in the past and weren't able to leverage these kinds of tools, I think probably you'll remember how difficult it was to move through literally hundreds or thousands of paper screening tools. And the math is easy, but doing it 1,000 or 2,000 times takes quite a bit of time and does not lend itself to an efficient system. Next slide. So this is what I was alluding to before, kind of the shifts in practice. We went from active consent to passive consent with opt-out procedures that allowed for us to be really efficient in terms of not waiting for those consent forms to come back, sending the message that this was important and just as important as all of the other things that we already screened for, like vision and hearing. Paper and pencil screening went away, and we went with a digital format where students were using either their iPads or their phones or computers in the school to be able to engage in screening. We went from single student and small group screening to grade level, school-wide, and district-wide screening, and we ultimately leveraged our entire faculty to be able to administer screening. And let me clarify that teachers and administrators outside of the school mental health staff do not see the results. They don't engage with the results, but they are reading the opt-out procedures to the students. They are pointing the students to the link to be able to take the screening tool. And we have our school mental health team that are waiting in the wings to be able to receive that data and follow up with students. So it allows for the people that need to work on that data to be free to do so instead of actually administering the screening. Next slide. So this is a huge piece, and perhaps the most important piece of screening that you actually follow up, that we're not screening for the sake of screening. So we do review the data immediately following all our screening windows. like I said, within 20 minutes, the data is prepared and ready. The follow-up that is conducted is with the student's specific school mental health staff member. Those students who a staff member is assigned to will be called down, and we ensure that, you know, there are many reasons to come down to the counseling office. We do not. It is not the case that post-screening everyone who is leaving a classroom is identified as a student who's scored in the moderate to severe range on these tools. We also make it a point to call students down for other reasons during that time period. So it's just it doesn't lend itself to any kind of concern on behalf of the student to come down and talk to a counselor. So clinical interviews conducted for those students that we are concerned about, and we have some decision-making tools and some data rules that really point us to, you know, this student perhaps is presenting with an elevated score that is telling us that they need something more. But I'll say this, any data point is not worth a lot unless it is validated, unless we actually have the conversation with the student and ensure that what that screening result indicated is confirmed, and that we can then move to decisions about service. Next slide. So a huge consideration in terms of following up with students. 100% of students who need follow-up, and those are students who score in the moderate to severe range, have that follow-up meeting with a school mental health staff member within 7 days. Any students who indicate any degree of suicidal ideation or intent to harm themselves receive same-day follow-up. We, at the beginning, were not entirely sure what we were going to be looking at in terms of referrals. So we kind of went all in on spooling up crisis teams to be able to be on call. We called up our community-based partners and said, listen, you're likely going to receive some calls today. Please have staff available. We planned with them ahead of time. The good news is we ultimately did not need them, and we had the internal capacity to be able to address the needs of our students without calling in crisis teams. But I would strongly recommend having that contingency plan in place, just so that you aren't painting yourself into a corner. Next slide. So now I want to talk about, you know, we've talked about the practices, we've talked about consent and selecting tools and building the capacity for screening to happen and how it's delivered and how we analyze results. But I do want to talk about the specific tools that we used over time and what that resulted in terms of data. So the specific screening tools that we used in the 15-16 school year, when we really started to test these practices on a larger scale after going through several PDSA cycles, the GAD-7, it's an anxiety screener, the PHQ-9, 9-question depression screener, which I see in a ton of doctors' offices really all the time now. Now that we've implemented screening, people will come up to us around Methuen, and they'll say, well, isn't this the screening tool that, you know, my son or daughter took? And we'll say, yeah, I mean, these are valid, reliable tools that that's why we're using them, because we feel we can trust them. Our CADS is a longer screening tool, and the reason behind that is this is a tool that we use with our students in grades 5 through 8, and there are not as many opportunities to screen at that level in our district, so we wanted to use a little bit more of a comprehensive internalizing tool to be able to get the most bang for our buck. During that year, we conducted 2 large-scale screenings at the high school, and we piloted some screening at the grammar schools. Next slide. So it doesn't, actually it's not cut off, it's just a little squished. But ultimately, this is the kind of data that was produced when we were conducting those initial tests at a large scale level. And we found that about 22% of our students who were screened scored in the moderate to severe range. That's the kind of data that at the aggregate level, I think really will resonate with administrators and stakeholders to be able to show that this is an area of concern. This is something that we need to address. We know that anxiety and depression and other specific mental health problems have a negative impact on academic performance. When we're able to show that and show the number of students and show the degree to which it's a problem, I think it really speaks to how important it is to implement school mental health services and supports. Next slide. And what we'll see here is that we, similar in terms of results, about a 20% of students scoring in the moderate to severe range for depression. Next slide. We'll go to 16-17 school year. We decided to add a global scale into the mix and to be able to understand some of the other problems that perhaps our students were faced with. All students in grades 9 through 12 took the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire. One of the things I liked about this was it had a pro-social subscale that allowed for us to understand students' strengths to a degree. And then in grades 3 and 4, we wanted to pilot a multi-gated approach to screening where the teacher would select a small number of students, 3 to 5 students, who they perceive to be at risk. And then to complete the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, the teacher report version on behalf of those students so that we could get some data to be able to inform our interventions with those students. That year, we also piloted substance use screening. Some of you may be familiar with SBIRT, Screening, Brief Intervention, and Referral for Treatment. It's an evidence-based substance abuse intervention model using the CRAFT screener. We screened 2 grade levels, grades 9 and 7, and then we did scale up RCAD screening to all students in grades 5 through 8 in the 16-17 school year. For SBIRT, we found that really, I guess I'll just say quickly about SBIRT, I did not find that the process really lent itself to a ton of referrals. We did receive some, and those students did receive some quality care afterward. We were able to intervene on them early, on behalf of them early, but the more important piece was that it built a tremendous amount of rapport with the school mental health staff because we were broaching a really serious topic with these students. They were seeing that they could be safe talking about this kind of a topic with one of our staff members, and that they could trust that we would maintain confidentiality so that following this screening, they came back with a lot of other issues that did not relate to substance use, but that were important to address nonetheless. Next slide. This is just a brief breakdown that kind of shows the calendar of screening. We try to ensure that our screening happens mostly on the front end of the year. Next slide. And then really the area, screening by area of concern. So this is just kind of a visual of what we screen for at which grade level. Next slide. We're using the student engagement instrument over the past year and a half. This is a tool that we wanted to include as a means of understanding as we address students' mental health concerns. Are we seeing an increase in student engagement? And I think that that's going to be one of the ways in which we can point to a pro-social outcome for screening. We're also embedding screening practices into the tiered support process to ensure that our students receive screening when there are initial signs of concern. And I do want to point out the SHAPE system, the online repository screening and progress monitoring tools that has been really beneficial to us, and I've made some recommendations for sure to districts in Massachusetts that these things are, for the vast majority of these tools, they are free. So when we talk about sustainability, it's really critical to, from a funding standpoint, to find tools that are reliable but also free. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about, why screen? What's the purpose of this? And I think the idea behind it is, one, the obvious one, we identify students and we identify them early. That proactive identification piece allows for us to get services in place before crisis happens, because otherwise we're really just reacting to crisis and waiting for things to happen that are much harder to address. When we first implemented screening on a large scale, we saw a 63% increase in the identification of students who require mental health services. And I look at a figure like that and I think of that we were identifying students. It wasn't that screening was the only means by which we identified students, but without screening, we were missing a lot of students, and we were missing them for quite some time. So that I think that that number in particular really speaks for me to how important this program is, or this practice is from an identification standpoint. Next slide. So the other piece of this is that the use of this aggregated psychosocial data can do so much for your school mental health program. It's this ongoing needs assessment that helps you to understand your population's needs over time. It can inform curriculum design delivery. It can inform the design of Tier 2 interventions. And one thing that I didn't mention, but that's really important, is that our group therapy program at the high school now is entirely driven by the screening, our practice of screening, so that when we conduct a screening, we are immediately able to make referrals to our group therapy program. And for anyone who's tried to establish a group program, I think that one of the things that I notice often is the fact that the referral process tends to be this nebulous piece where you have one or two referrals here and one or two referrals there, but then getting to a point where you can kind of get a cluster of students that make sense for a group, it's very difficult without a strong referral procedure. So tying it to screening ensures that we are getting a cluster of students immediately following screening that we can then follow up with and determine whether or not they're appropriate for that service. I think that we'll go through, I don't want to belabor this data too much, but suffice to say, we continue to collect data related to depression and anxiety and across all those other scales. Next slide, we can keep going. This in particular was something that we were able to pick up and that very much turned heads in our district when we were able to say, you know, in grades 5 through 8, 13.36% of students scored in the moderate to severe range. That's the kind of data that I think really allows for us to put at the forefront of people's, at the forefront of what people think we need. It makes mental health and school mental health in particular something that is seen as incredibly valuable and necessary. Next slide. I'll talk briefly about progress monitoring. We can kind of jump right into it, but we use the same data or the same screening tools to monitor progress over time. I think that one of the things that I always ask of districts that I meet with is, you know, how do you know that your therapeutic interventions work? What data are you using? And a lot of times I think that we're looking at that are secondary or tertiary outcomes that don't directly relate to the services that we provide. So I want to really ensure that we're using psychosocial data to determine whether or not our interventions work. Next slide. And we can keep going. So when we talk about psychosocial progress monitoring, I'm talking about symptom presentation, emotional regulation, which I would define as symptom presentation over time, specific behaviors that we want to monitor, engagement. We can use a student engagement instrument or the teacher-completed student engagement instrument. But at the end of the day, these are things that directly relate to the services that we provide. Next slide. Here are just some examples of graphical representations of the data that we have been working with over the past few years. This is a student that I work with for, I believe, 6 to 8 months. And when I'm able to graphically represent the changes in symptom presentation over time, I think it provides a much more accessible view into why our services are important. Next slide. And we continually get fancy with our with our graphs, and we're able to paint a picture of student symptom presentation over time. But this is for individuals who attend IEP meetings, for individuals who are trying to justify that, termination is a hugely important piece of the therapeutic process, to be able to say, this is the change that has happened over time, and we are approaching a point where we need to either fade or terminate services because the student is showing incredible progress. Next slide. Just one last graphical representation, and this is with a lot of different measures on there, and yeah, we can move to the next slide. We also conducted this with group, so that when our group therapy program was engaged in providing services, that we were ensuring that those services were monitored throughout the process. Next slide. I won't belabor this, just really a nice way of understanding intervention and treatment planning at Tier 3. Next slide. This is something we're really proud of. We use our aggregated screening data to be able to understand the changes year to year. We've seen a 7.22% increase in student scoring in the no concern range, about a 6% decrease in student scoring in the moderate to severe range. And this is all information that we put into an accountability report that allows for us to speak to our stakeholders around, this is the impact of our work. Next slide. Similar graph, but with a little bit of a larger positive outcome in terms of our impact on anxiety. Next slide. So I know that we were moving at an incredibly alarming rate. I am thrilled to field questions. This is normally an hour to an hour and a half presentation, so I want to make sure to be sensitive to whatever questions you have, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John. This is a wealth of information. Thank you for talking us through the process. I think we'll hold questions till the end so we can make sure we have enough time to get through Dr. Furlong's presentation as well. And so we'll switch gears and turn it over to Dr. Furlong. We can see you. Thank you. And then we go ahead and ask questions to both John and Michael at the end. On to you.
I'm on? Okay, I can't see myself, but I was wondering. So welcome everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today and to learn from the seminar. And I'll be brief. I know we don't have much more time, so I'll be happy to talk with any of you later if you think it might be helpful. I want to recognize my wonderful colleagues, Erin Dowdy and Karen Nyland Gibson. Also, the screening considerations that John just talked about are totally consistent with the approach we've taken. I think very comprehensive approach. I was very impressed, one to emulate. A couple of distinctions, so they kind of set for what I'm going to be talking about is, in our approach, we actually don't use the word screening. We actually just refer to it as monitoring, as John was referring to later in the his part of the presentation, and that we're actually saying this is not a one-off, which screening sometimes has that connotation. But we're trying to actually think of it as we're wanting to keep track of students' wellness, if they're healthy and if they're thriving. And that's kind of the general approach that we think about when we take it. The context, I realized I've added this in, is this approach and the measures that we use in here were developed out of our participation in the evaluation of 2 Safe School Healthy Student projects here in Santa Barbara County a few years back. So these measures were generated out of interests of the school to try to measure and monitor students, other aspects of students' wellness and strengths, in addition to expressing concern about any emotional distress that they might be experiencing. Okay, next slide. So just to start off, if you take a look at this particular slide, you'll see there's an item up there. This is an item that is from Scott Hubner's life satisfaction scale. So the statement is one that is, my life is going well, and the students are asked to respond to this item in this 6-point Likert scale. So in considering the statement, how would we want our own children to answer this statement? Our grandchildren, our mentees, the students that we work with. Certainly, I think we would agree that they should at least respond in some degree of agreement with this item, and most preferably we'd want them to answer moderately or strongly agree. But we infrequently include such wellness items in our screening or monitoring surveys, and should we? So just briefly, I want to give you a sense of, yes, I think we should. Next slide, please. So as this slide shows here, we have included this item, actually. We have a study that I'll be mentioning briefly, which is called the California Student Wellness Study. And it's to illustrate that, of course, ill-being and well-being are related to one another. So however, our students' responses to this well-being item related to other items that we might be interested in terms of student self-report of any emotional challenges they might be experiencing. So in this case, we asked the item, the students responded to the item from the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey, which is the question that asked them if they've thought about suicide in the past 12 months. And as you can see, yes, students' responses to ill-being and well-being items are related to one another. Students who do not feel that their life is going well, on the left side of that slide, 49%, are substantially more likely to report that they've had suicidal thoughts in the last year. Next slide, please. And to take a different perspective, this also illustrates another approach that we take. This chart shows the association between Eubner's life satisfaction item and an item from Corey Keyes's mental health continuum short form, which is another measure that we use. This is an item that assesses social well-being. So the students who disagree with the satisfaction item report feeling that they make a contribution in significant ways only 1 or 2 times a month. You can see that their average response on that Likert scale was only 2.3, as opposed to 4.7 for students who strongly agreed with the item that my life is going well. So for example, our partner schools, oops. Sorry, I forgot to mute my phone. I apologize. So for example, our partner schools do not ask items in the general universal screening like the YRBS suicide items. Our assessments tend to focus exclusively on whether students are doing well. So next item, next slide. So these are some resources. So if you're going to engage in some strength-based positive assessment as part of your screening monitoring process, these are some of the go-to resources now. The Center for Social Emotional Learning, CASEL. There's another study that's going on that's called the Children's World International Study, Children's Wellbeing Study. The Office of Economic Development and Study of Social Emotional Skills is developing a very comprehensive, strength-based measure that is based on the Big Five personality inventory. And the RAND Corporation has also put together an online resource where you can search for and look for measures that relate to social emotional learning and academic competence. If we go to the next slide. So on our website, if you look under there, you will see it says research. Under that research menu option, there is a sub-menu that says presentations. I have posted on there a document. It is document number 4 in that list, which provides you a description of each of those resources I just mentioned from the previous slide, and that provides you with a hyperlink index to those resources. So you can find out more there. Of course, in our context today, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Project Co-Vitality. That's summarize the work that we're doing on this website. Under the research link, there's links to the many studies that we've done to validate the measures that we've been using. And you also know, I won't go into great depth, obviously, but there's a strategies link that also provides access to resources that counselors and psychologists and teachers could use to support their interests, to support the social emotional development of students. Next slides, please. I won't go into this in great depth, but this is the core measure that we've developed, the Social Emotional Health Survey. I'm sharing this with you now just so you can get a sense of some of the positive psychological mindsets that are included in this measure, such as gratitude, zest, optimism, self-control, emotional regulation, as John just mentioned. So this is a measure that we've been developing and have been using in our studies. Next slide, please. The measures here represent what would be the core measures that are used in our universal screening with our partner schools, which I graciously acknowledge because we're doing this as a resource for the schools to monitor and support their students, but also because this is integrated into our research activities here at the university. So the schools, we couldn't do it without the support of the schools, which we appreciate. Just to mention briefly, we have also used other measures, the AdHealth school connected measure, the psychological sense of school membership measure. Other times we've piloted the use of the DOS-21, the Depression, Anxiety, Stress Scale. We use another instrument, the Me and My School Scale, which is a emotional distress measure developed specifically for students 8 to 12 years old. We've used the BASC-BEST, the PANIS, we've used the GAD-7 and PHQ-9 that John have used, and the SDQ. So we've had experience with those instruments too. And next slide, please. So I won't go over this in depth. I wasn't anyway, but we also follow a step-by-step guide. Next slide, please. Of course, the presentation that John had was exemplary. There's great information there on the steps to follow. You can see that I thought what I would do here today is just to briefly mention that all steps are important, but they're not equally resource demanding. So survey administration is an example. It's easier said than done, as John alluded to, because this is more than just distributing papers or getting parental consent. So just to focus briefly on that, to give you a sense of what we do with our schools, when we administer the surveys, we set them up in Qualtrics. Each school gets their own unique link, depending on the school resources. The students at schools now often have tablets. Those schools administer the survey. They're able to do it in 20 to 25 minutes, and they're able to we've had schools of 2,000 students completed in one morning. Others might have tablets or carts that they have to move from classroom to classroom, or a use of computer labs. We have developed reports in the Qualtrics format. Yep, okay, almost the next slide. And we show from year to year. So the reports are now developed. The school gets their report back the next day. Given that we're using this for research, purposes also, when the students at the schools do the survey, they do provide an ID number. After we get that information, the data is exported into SPSS file, and we use wellness and distress response items to help the care team evaluate student individual needs and prioritize their follow-up support and efforts. Next slide, please. Yeah, so let me get down to here. There we go. Okay, so we employ in our process to evaluate the needs of students is what has been called a dual factor or dual continua and bidimensional model. So next slide. There, and there's a transition. So you see it's really two continua, related continua. So there's one with distress, students reporting on some measure of distress, and also then some measures of well-being. So you look at the combination of the two. You go to the next slide, please. And so if we think of doing screening or monitoring, students who are particularly low on well-being and high on distress measures, looking at the combination of the two then identifies the students that the care teams at the school identifies wanting to follow up on. Next slide, please. And this is just another way of thinking about complete mental health. Clearly, our goal is that we want all students to be in the flourishing range of development, and our particular concerns are for students who might be distressed. Now, the advantage of doing the dual factor or dual bidimensional approach is that if we just do screening just for student distress, we would only identify the students with distress and not that lower left quadrant of students, students who some have called as languishing. These are students who are not reporting substantial emotional concerns at the moment, but they're also very low on personal strengths and assets. And these are students who might be vulnerable to some more substantial mental health problems in the future if they were not given type of support. So next slide, please. So of course, again, this is easier suggested than done, because when we are using any screening measure, one still needs to consider cut scores. So in this chart, for example, if you look on the left y-axis, if you used the BASC-BESS as a distress screener, and if that was used, the cut score or decision score could be a T-score of 65, as shown here, and this is what the BESS manual suggests. And there is, but one would also need to then simultaneously administer and consider some wellness index. And in this example here, I use a simple one-item global life satisfaction rating scale that goes from 0 to 100. It's an option in Qualtrics for how you can have students respond to the question. So the mean here, which is shown as 72, you see you have two cut scores to decide, well, who are we going to follow up with in this dual factor model. That's actually the average of responses that we have gotten from 120,000 students in grades 7 to 12. So in other words, at some point you have to have some criterion for deciding, well, where is the critical point? And the same would be true whether you're doing a distress-focused screening approach or whether you're using a bi-dimensional approach. And of course, as my point here is to recognize that when we're doing this, decisions about where we put the cut points have direct implications for the number of students that we identify and we need to follow up with. Next slide, please. And there's also error. But one issue that's not often addressed when we think about screening is whether or not these measures are co-normed with one another. They're usually not. So distributions may not be the same for both measures. They're not derived from the same sample. Rarely are any of the measures we've using actually been based on large normative samples. One option is to develop local norms. And of course, the combination of which measures to use is always a question that still needs to be addressed. In our case, what we feel fortunate to have the opportunity to do is just this past month, we completed data collection on the California Student Wellness Study. And the students, and we're already preparing documents that will present validation information for this approach to school-based mental health screening. You can see there that we have a sample of 120,000 students, 290 schools. We also have a subsample of students that we've been following 3 years during their high school years. And this information is also going to be integrated with the California Healthy Kids Survey, which is a youth risk behavior surveillance type survey that our schools use. I want to note that the large data set is anonymous. And again, when we're working with our partner schools, after getting appropriate parental permission, student assent, the students provide an ID number which provides the care teams at the school the information they need to follow up on with them. Next slide, please. And then just as an FYI, we don't leave the young children out. This shows the 3 measures that we use when we're trying to measure wellness with elementary school students. So we have a junior version of the social emotional health survey. We have the Me and My Schools measure, which is specifically to assess distress in students 8 to 12 years old. And we've adapted a version of the psychological sense of school membership that looks at students' sense of connections to schools. Another excellent resource that you'll want to look at is Tyler Renshaw's a UCSB graduate. And Tyler has a website and has access to many assessment tools that can be used to monitor wellness among elementary school students. Next slide, please. And all of what I've talked about here and our approach to doing screening is described in 3 documents that we prepared, and they are posted on the website. The one at the top shows our approach to doing screening at a universal and interfacing with a tier 2 follow-up approach. The second document there provides a way of thinking about integrating multiple aspects of data needs in school which relate to school safety, school climate, and school mental health. And then the last one provides descriptions of some other instruments that you might be interested in pursuing, one of which is Learner has what they call the Positive Youth Development Questionnaire, and there are 5 C's where they look at competence, confidence, connection, character, and caring youth, and then also contribution. And Kern has a measure based on Seligman's adult perma-flourishing model called the EPOCH, the EPOCH, which looks at engagement, perseverance, optimism, connectedness, and happiness. Those latter 2 documents include illustrations and examples of how some local education agencies in California have been implementing these assessments in their schools. And these summaries were written by the personnel at the school who were implementing them. So Jen, next slide. Just real briefly, I know you're from many places. As far as I can tell, I know there are at least one school or in each of these states that have been using these measures as part of their school-wide assessment. And next slide. And we're also just very grateful that in fact these measures have been and are starting to be implemented in various places all around the world. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. And I'm happy to follow up as might be helpful for you all. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Furlong, and thank you again, John. So I'm glad we have some time left to open it up to questions. I know we have a couple that are in the chat, but I'll open up if anyone wants to ask those aloud as well. So while folks are thinking and getting those, I'll ask these first 2 from Dr. Hoover. Is this measure available in the public domain? And why should I screen for distress and wellness instead of just psychopathology? So what would be that response to a district?
Okay, Scott Eubner, he's at the University of South Carolina, and he posts these measures online. And these are measures that have been around for many years. They're available, and you can use them. And the second part of the question, I'm sorry, was?
So the question would be, if a district asks, why should I screen for distress and wellness instead of just psychopathology, what would your response be?
Honestly, we say we don't screen for psychopathology. We think it scares people away from doing screening. We say our interest is that all children, 100%, would be well, and we want to do measures that are relevant for all students, and that's where we think in a multi-tier system of support. If we're doing this, we should have a coordination with the counselors, social workers, psychologists, others at school who follow up systematically with students and make sure if there are other deeper psychological needs that they address them. So that's what we say. Our approach is to say we're trying to assess student wellness as opposed to assess student psychopathology directly.
Great, thank you.
But we need to have a balanced approach.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll be quiet to open it up if anyone wants to ask a question aloud. You're also welcome to put those in the chat, and any questions, of course, for John as well.
I'm seeing one in the chat. How do you report findings back to students and families? So we in Methuen, after we've conducted our coordinated follow-up with students, we definitely want to be sensitive to confidentiality, and I know that is going to definitely look different depending on which level you're in. And I know that it's definitely a huge topic in schools in general. But at the end of the day, students are made aware of their results as a function of the follow-up that's conducted with the school mental health staff, and we do encourage students to engage with their families around of what they are needing at that moment too.
John, we're starting to lose you. You're cutting in and out. And we can follow up with John if there's additional information. We can send out Dr. Furlong and Mr. Crocker's information are both in the chat. I'm sure they would welcome additional questions. We are at the top of our time. We want to thank them so much for their time and expertise and wealth of resources and knowledge. Thank you so much for joining us today as we talk about this topic. We look forward to our additional virtual learning sessions. Please don't forget to complete and give feedback on today's session, and we look forward to talking with everyone at our next virtual learning session. Have a wonderful afternoon.